Hey everyone, and welcome to day 7 of Food Addiction Recovery Week on Chef AJ Live. You know, in the Bible, they say that on the 7th day, the Lord rested, but Dr. Goldhamer never takes a day off, and either does your addictions. You know, they say that when you're getting sober, your addiction is in the corner doing push-ups. And so we have for day 7 on this very special week, Dr. Alan Goldhamer. He's the co-founder of the TrueNorth Health Center and the co-author of The Pleasure Trap, and he is a straight shooter, and he's going to tell it like it is. And we're going to address the question today, are there chemicals that are added to the food that make it addictive? Please welcome Dr. Alan Goldhamer.
Hi, AJ.
Hi, this is such a great topic for you because you are really the SOS king.
Well,
SOS free.
The fact is, though, that people are being exposed to chemicals that have been added to their food that artificially stimulate dopamine production in their brain and lead to an addictive response. And if you don't recognize that, then it's going to be really difficult to make the right decisions to help escape the dietary pleasure trap and to deal with the consequences of food addiction.
Well, I appreciate you saying this so much because many of the doctors on this week are in your circle. They're Dr. Frank Sabatino, Dr. Stefan Esser, and Dr. Joel Furman's coming up. And they, I think, would agree with you because they're some of the only doctors that not only recommend a plant-based diet or vegan diet, but one free of sugar, oil, and salt.
Well, you know, to really understand why it's necessary to take such a radical kind of approach to food, you really have to go back and think about who we are and what we are as humans. And if you go back in our ancestral history, you realize that we evolved in an environment that's very different than the environment we live in today. We evolved in an environment of scarcity. It was really tough for humans to get enough to eat and to avoid being eaten. As a consequence, most of the people that were born on this planet did not live long enough to reproduce. They did not pass on their DNA. They're what we call losers. Now, your ancestors were not the losers. Your ancestors were the winners. They were the ones that got enough to eat, didn't get eaten, and lived long enough to reproduce. And they passed on their DNA. And your genes, your DNA, are from your winner ancestors. And they had certain characteristics that allowed them to be winners. And one of those characteristics was that they were able to differentiate valuable high caloric density foods from less valuable low caloric density foods. People that, for example, let's say that all you ever wanted to eat was salad and you didn't like more concentrated foods. Your chances of surviving in a natural setting would be somewhat less than a person that would relish more concentrated calories. The reason is because to get enough salad to survive, you need like 20 pounds a day. It has about 100 calories a pound. 20 pounds a day would be about 2,000 calories. So eating 20 pounds of salad is a real challenge. You'd have to start at about 6 a.m. You'd have to eat continuously till midnight, and you still would have trouble getting 20 pounds a day in. So any person that had a predilection to strongly prefer low density foods probably didn't make it. Clearly, they weren't our ancestors. Our ancestors that survived were the ones that craved the most concentrated foods that were available to them. And in a natural setting, those are things like fruit, complex carbohydrates like starchy vegetables and nuts and seeds and things of this nature. And so the genes that we have that make up our cognitive capacities, our brains, drive us to seek the most concentrated calories that we can and eat as much as we can. And in a natural setting, that works great because you eat as much as you can. And if you're really lucky and you're really good at it, you may get just enough to survive and live to the next day. The problem is we don't live in that environment anymore. We've changed the environment very dramatically. And one of the changes we made in the environment is we changed our feed. So although we used to eat simple, whole, natural foods, now we eat highly processed foods, flour products, sugar products, foods that have chemicals added to them that stimulate that dopamine production in our brain. And the dopamine is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. So it's not surprising that the higher the caloric density of the food, the more dopamine is produced. Because your brain's job is to keep you alive. And your brain rewards your body every time your body engages in behavior that favors survival and reproduction. So that when your brain eats more concentrated calories, your brain squirts out, or when your body eats more concentrated calories, your brain squirts out more dopamine, more pleasure. So you like those concentrated calories because your ancestors that liked those concentrated calories were the few that managed to get enough to eat and not get eaten. So now we change the environment where we have all these highly processed foods, and those genetics get us into trouble because now, unlike the environment of the past, there is no scarcity. There's an abundance of highly processed, very concentrated foods available. And your brain just goes, oh, baby, give it to me. This is great. And so when you have constant exposure to highly concentrated foods, unless you override it psychoconsciously, you're going to overeat. The only question is how much, how fat are you going to get and what disease are you going to develop? And so along the way, food manufacturers recognize this, that the more concentrated the foods, the more you like the food. That's what liking food is, or good tasting food is. It means it results in more dopamine production in your brain. And so if you eat foods with a high caloric density, let's say, for example, you eat fruit compared to salad. Fruit has 300 calories a pound rather than 100 calories a pound. Your brain likes it better because every time you eat a mouthful of fruit, you get 3 times as much dopamine production. If you eat potatoes, rice, and beans with 500 calories a pound, you'll like that more than you will salad with 100 calories a pound, particularly if you're hungry. Nuts and seeds, oh my goodness, with 3 times the caloric density, you're going to be enjoying those even more. And as a consequence, there's a great tendency to overeat. And food manufacturers recognize this. So what they did is they took these highly processed food byproducts like oil, sugar, and salt and started adding them to food. And you can take almost anything that's food, add enough salt, oil, and sugar, and people will like it even more than they did in the original form because there's more dopamine production. And as a consequence, now the foods are often essentially nothing but highly processed calories, because that's the way you get people to like them even more. That's why when you go to the fair, they don't just take, say, a candy bar with all of its concentrate. They want to deep fry it. They want to increase the caloric density even more, so it's a special treat. And so the higher the caloric density, the more dopamine, the more tendency there is to eat it, the more you're going to like it. And that's why today 93% of calories come from animal food or highly processed, pleasure-trapped, chemicalized foods. And only 7% of calories come from fruits and vegetables. And even that, 1/3 of it's potatoes served as French fries and potato chips. Right now, fruits and vegetables are the decoration on the plate. They don't even make a statistically significant percentage of the calories of people that are eating out there. We take one of those chemicals, sugar, and people are consuming as much as 150 pounds a year. Now, that's an average. I don't eat any, which means somebody's eating my share too. It's gotten completely out of hand. And then, of course, oil with 9 calories per gram is the most concentrated substance that we get exposed to, with 2.5 times the amount of calories of pure sugar. And then we take it and we use like potatoes as sponges to soak the grease up when we make fried foods, French fries, potato chips, and the like, increasing the caloric density tremendously. And that's what people are eating. 25% of the calories of teenagers in the United States come from the sugar just in soda pop, just in sugar fortified drinks. It's not at all surprising that we've become overweight. 70% of people now overweight or obese. Type 2 diabetes becoming epidemic, increasing geometrically. We've got some really serious problems, and we don't recognize it because we don't recognize that sugar, oil, and salt are chemicals added to food that make us overweight. People often ask about salt. They say, well, how could salt make you fat? There's no calories in salt. How could something with no calories make you fat? It's funny too, because there's a lot of no-calorie beverages out there that also have been shown the more you consume, the fatter you get. Even though there's no calories in the beverage itself, the net effect on your apathetic mechanisms are such that you end up eating more than you would if you weren't using these supposedly calorie-free substances. In the case of salt, salt stimulates passive overeating. If you eat your fill to where you feel satiated or satisfied, you'll eat a certain amount of something, say rice. Everything else being equal, if you salt that rice up, you'll eat more of it before you feel satisfied. And the reason is people say, well, yeah, it tastes better. And that's right. That's what tasting better is. The salted rice stimulates more dopamine production than the regular rice, leading you to overeating. So if you'd like to lose weight or keep it off, one of the things that's helpful is to eliminate these chemicals that are fooling your brain. Just like an alcoholic has to stop drinking, a person that's overweight, if they want to be successful at losing weight and keep it off, need to eliminate the SOS, the salt, oil, and sugar. Remember, SOS, it's the international symbol of danger, and it stands for the chemicals added to food that make you fat, and that's salt, oil, and sugar.
That's brilliant. But I don't think people think of salt, oil, and sugar as chemicals. I think they think of them as ingredients.
Yeah, well, they are chemicals. In fact, they're not whole foods. You don't fall into the oil pond. You don't get, problems with the sugar patch. These are highly processed foods. To make sugar, for example, is pretty tricky. You can chew on sugar cane all day long, but to concentrate a large amount of sugar into a small amount of, a large amount of sugar cane into a small amount of sugar is a manufacturing task of some accomplishment. And the same thing with salt. Salt used to be such a rare and precious commodity that it was used as a means of exchange. That's the term salary. But now, of course, we learned how to process it, and now it's ubiquitous.
Do you know when the processing of salt, sugar, and oil began in the timeline of human history? And I'm guessing that before that, people didn't suffer with food addiction.
Well, it's relatively recent in human history. In fact, it's interesting, not just humans, but animals. There is no obesity in natural population of animals. Even animals you think of as fat are not fat. Whales, for example, are only 9% body fat. They wear the fat out of their body, but they're actually lean, mean machines. And no animals or humans are able to achieve and maintain obesity consistently unless salt, oil, and or sugar are added into their diets. Populations that don't eat significant quantities of these substances don't sustain obesity. And all we've done is we've increased our use of sugar from being a rare special treat, 10, 15 pounds a year, to where now it's a staple in the diet, 150 pounds a year. And our government encourages it. There's subsidies to make sure that these highly processed fractionated foods are cheap, readily available. Manufacturers love it. And it's not serving us well, as you can see by the epidemic of obesity. And the problem with obesity is not just being fat makes you buy bigger clothes. It's that it suppresses your immune response and makes you vulnerable to dying from heart disease, cancer of the breast, prostate, lung, and colon, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, even things like COVID-19. People that are overweight have a substantial higher risk of dying from becoming infected with even viruses of this nature. So it's affecting us all the way downstream. It's a major problem. And it's hard to solve the problem because people don't recognize that it even exists.
You mentioned that the more calorically concentrated the calories, the more dopamine is released. So if that's true, what is the possible incentive for anybody eating calorically dilute food? If calorically dense food was
well, there's no benefit or incentive at all, unless your goal is to live a long and healthy life and live your life fully and functional, and then go to sleep one night and not wake up, rather than spending the last 10 years of your life unable to talk and move, waiting for people to come and change your diaper.
Okay. Who discovered that the more calorically concentrated the calories, the more dopamine is released? I don't think a lot of people know this.
I think that it was popularized in a book that came out about 12 years ago. It's called The Pleasure Trap. And Dr. Lyle really was instrumental in tying the connection there between neurochemistry and caloric density. And so I think that certainly the popularization of this concept was first done in The Pleasure Trap.
But whose research? I'm just curious where this concept first started, because what if you just ate 10 pounds of salad? Can you get as much dopamine as if you ate a food that was 1,000 calories per pound?
Well, that's a good question. We'll have to ask Dr. Lyle, actually does all the research to tell us exactly who and when it happened. And I'm sure he'll be more than happy to do that in great detail. Next opportunity, we have to ask him that question.
Well, he was actually on Monday, and he was amazing. But I'm just curious, if you eat enough low calorie dense food, can you still get enough dopamine to feel pleasure?
Yeah, you absolutely get pleasure from lower caloric density foods. It's just not a drug-like effect. It's like saying, can you enjoy soft classical music, or can you only enjoy music if it's loud rock and roll, loud enough to damage your hearing? The fact is, you can enjoy music, and the more you listen to music quietly, the more you learn to be able to enjoy it and get a great deal of pleasure from it. I would argue that people that listen to softer music get every bit as much pleasure in the long run overall as people that listen to loud rock and roll. And the people listening to soft music don't damage their hearing as a consequence, losing the ability to listen to music at all.
Yeah. Fool the brain satiety mechanism. Expound on that, because I that's just beyond
So we
my.
talk about in the pleasure trap, we talk about Dr. Lau coined the term YOW circuits. You're overweight, eat less. And basically it's a recognition of the fact that the brain has an ability to tell you how much to eat. That we know these circuits work really well because on whole natural foods, people maintain optimum weight. In order to maintain optimum weight, you have to have a very carefully controlled caloric intake. A little bit of variation one way or the other would result in substantial weight loss or weight gain. And so the mechanisms in the brain and the stomach, in the mouth, all work together to make sure you get enough to eat without getting too much or too little. It works perfectly in the entire animal kingdom, as you see all around you. And it works perfectly in humans unless you introduce these highly processed foods. And that's true for animals or humans. If you take rats and you give them ad libitum eating as much as they want of their natural chow, they get to a certain size. But you put these chemicals in their chow, the oil, the salt, the sugar, they'll gain as much as 49% of their body weight in 60 days. They get fat not because of psychological reasons. It wasn't mommy rat loved him too much or daddy rat didn't love him or they had stress from having to go to work. These are biological reasons that they gain weight. And it's the fooling of the brain satiety mechanisms and the overstimulation of dopamine production. And so, we can blame psychology for a lot of things, but the reality is, weight is largely a biological phenomenon. If you take people, even emotionally scarred people with lots of unfortunate emotional stress and trauma and history, but restrict them to eating whole plant food, SOS-free diet, they will lose weight down to their optimum weight. So, it's not that these issues aren't important. They are, because attitude determines action, but it's your action that determines the outcome. So it may be really hard for a person with a lot of emotional issues to make good decisions. But if those good decisions are made one way or the other, the result is very predictable.
Are there other ways to get dopamine naturally other than food?
Yeah, well, food and sex are the main normal natural stimulants of dopamine production. And it makes sense because it's feeding behavior and sexual behavior that are necessary for the DNA to survive. And so they feed food and sex, food and sex, food and sex are the only natural concentrated sources of dopamine. Unless you're male, then it's sex and food. But either way, food and sex and food, these are the normal stimulants. But humans got clever and we learned how to artificially stimulate dopamine production. The most obvious is drugs, alcohol, cocaine, caffeine. These drugs work largely because they stimulate dopamine production. They induce a state of pleasure. The problem is it's an artificial stimulation and it can lead to addiction. Call it alcoholism in the case of alcohol, where people are drinking not just to feel good, but to avoid feeling very bad, which is kind of the hallmark of addiction. And the same thing happens with sugar, oil, and salt. You eat it, it makes you feel good because it stimulates dopamine production, but you can literally become addicted to that artificial stimulation. And now you crave those processed foods. You have to eat them in order to avoid feeling very bad. It's also complicated by blood sugar levels. When you eat sugar, for example, and refined carbohydrates, your blood sugar levels go up artificially. The body produces insulin to drive the sugar into the cells, but that artificial stimulation of insulin overshoots. Now your blood sugar levels drop. Now your brain thinks you're starving. And now you've got what's called binging and craving, because your brain literally thinks you're starving. Also, your brain is designed to relish fat. In a natural setting, if you can store a little bit of extra fat, particularly if you're a woman, which essentially is an energy conserving fat storage device, biologically speaking, you will store fat to survive a period of biological vulnerability called pregnancy. Males don't have to worry about that because males are incapable of having babies. Females can have babies, and as a consequence, they must store an extra percentage of fat in order to survive the vulnerability that happens when you go through the pregnancy process. And as a consequence, women that couldn't do that, that weren't very good fat storers, they didn't make it. Those are not your ancestors. Your ancestors were the ones that got enough to eat, didn't get eaten, stored the fat. They were really efficient fat storers. And so if you're a really efficient fat storer and you eat a highly concentrated diet, you're going to get fatter. So that's not a bad thing biologically. It's just a bad thing in the environment today, because maintaining excess fat increases your risk for metabolic syndrome, which leads you to premature death from heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and COVID-19.
Wow. So do you think food can be addictive, Dr. Goldhamer, or is it just particular foods?
Well, I think it's the chemicals that we add to food that make food addictive. It's just like if you chew on some coca leaves, you're not going to become a cocaine addict. Okay, your mouth may get a little numb from the small amount of cocaine, but if you process large amounts of coca leaf into cocaine, you can definitely become an addict. You know, we know and we see the devastating effect of that. If you are to chew on sugar cane, you're never going to achieve obesity. You can't get enough calories out of chewing on sugar, but you take a bunch of that sugar cane and you turn it into sugar, and now you can develop a drug-like effect from eating those processes and become addictive. So I think it's technically more of the chemicals that we add to the food that make food, quote, addictive. I don't think you will find active food addicts having the same difficulties on a whole natural food diet. You'll see oftentimes people with eating disorders who are craving highly concentrated foods. They're actually craving the drug-like effect that goes along, in my opinion, drug-like effect that goes along with the chemicals that have been added to that food. Now, that doesn't mean people can't overeat on whole natural foods. They can, but the problem is, like for example, apples. You can overeat on apples, but you won't do it very often, because when you do, you get a pretty good bellyache. You know, the body that has natural mechanisms to detect overconsumption of natural foods. You eat 1,500 calories of apples, you may not do that again too soon. You won't forget that. You eat 1,500 calories of ice cream, and all you're doing is banging your spoon on the bottom of the empty pint and wondering where the rest of it is. There's no natural feedback mechanism from highly processed concentrated foods that you would get, say, from whole natural foods. With whole natural foods, you feel full. Or there's other mechanisms. If you're eating walnuts, they might be really good. You keep eating too many of them, eventually you'll get a burning in your mouth, and you won't even want them, because your body will try to shut it off. You don't get the benefit of that from the chemicalized foods that manufacturers make that fool you into overconsumption.
You mentioned ice cream. Don't you have a funny story about your wife, Jennifer, when she was editing the book, The Pleasure Trap, about some ice cream in the house, and how even for somebody with her level of conscientiousness, it was difficult for her to not think about it?
Well, I don't think we've ever had ice cream in the house.
I heard, I don't know if this is true. I heard a story that your daughter was visiting, and you have another refrigerator or freezer maybe downstairs in the basement, and she was going to a party. So she had some like actual ice cream that she was responsible for taking.
Really?
And I don't think I'm making this story up. And that even Jennifer, she didn't eat it, but she said it was banging on her brain, knowing that food was there.
Well, I know that they say that they've imbued ice cream with language skills, because people will actually hear the ice cream calling out, "Eat me, eat me, eat me." And sometimes people feel like they have to eat it just to shut it up. I have patients with such good attenuation of their hearing, they can hear the ice cream calling all the way from the store down the road. So that's entirely possible. I'm not actually aware of that story, but it's also probably, if Kristen was at home, so that would have to have been at least 30 years ago. So it's probably quite a ways ago. So I may have passed that out of my short-term memory.
Okay, well, maybe you can ask Dr. Morano.
I'll definitely be asking her about that.
I don't want to be telling tall tales out of school, but I don't think I would just make something up. I had to somewhere. And maybe the ice cream was there just for a day or two, but she said she couldn't stop thinking about it.
Well, maybe she didn't tell me that it was there either. So,
or maybe you wouldn't have allowed it in the house. Dr. Goldhamer, we know that animal products are not healthy, but are they addictive? Or are they only addictive when we're adding sugar, fat, and salt to them?
Well, I think it's the oil, the sugar, the salt, and all the stuff that people add to make the dead, decaying flesh palatable. I mean, if you just take raw meat and boil it, it's not as appealing as when you're, cooking it in with all of the spices and sauces and gravies and dressings and all the things people have to do to make that substance more palatable. So I think that it's not the animal food itself that is addictive. It's the way we process and treat it, just like with foods. For example, animal foods would be considered a whole food. They may not be a healthy food, but it certainly would be a whole food. And you wouldn't have the tendency, and those people eating small amounts of animal food in their diet are unlikely to suffer the type of obesity that people would that are eating animal foods like fried or processed with the oil, salt, and the sugar, any more than people are likely to suffer with obesity because they're just eating brown rice. But if you're salting it and you're processing it, you're going to be more vulnerable. So I see the chemicals that we add to the foods, whether they be animal foods or whole foods, as the principal drug-like effect. So if you look at populations that eat mostly plant-based foods with some animal food in the diet, they tend not to have the obesity problems and other stuff that you would from highly processed foods. So I think that people could eat animal foods and still maintain optimum weight. But because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should do something. So the fact that we have the capacity to kill things and eat them doesn't mean we should or need to, or that it's in our net best interest. It's certainly not in the net best interest of the animal that you're killing. It's certainly not in the best interest of the planet, because we know that our animal husbandry practices are responsible for more of the global warming, methane production and stuff than the even internal combustion engines. It may not be good from a moral, ethical, and spiritual viewpoint. Some people argue that going on a vegan diet might help them from a moral, ethical, or spiritual viewpoint. I would argue that it might help you get into heaven, but it won't delay how quickly you get there. Because the reality is vegan diets can be incredibly unhealthy. Vegan just means you're not eating animal foods. It doesn't mean you're eating a healthy diet. Oil, salt, and sugar on a vegan diet are oftentimes dominant. For example, Coca-Cola may not have any animal foods in it. It may be a vegan food. It doesn't make it healthy. And I didn't say Coca-Cola, I meant soda pop, the generic term. Also, brand name cookies like Oreo cookies might be vegan, but just because they're vegan doesn't necessarily make them healthy. French fries may be vegan, doesn't mean that they're healthy. So I actually think that many vegans are motivated to be vegans for moral, ethical, spiritual, animal rights, environmental. Those are the reasons that motivate most vegans. And that explains why many vegans are unhealthy, because although their diet's vegan, it's not healthy. You need a vegan diet, but you also need an SOS-free diet, a diet free of salt, oil, sugar, refined carbohydrates, if you want to actually achieve and maintain optimal health. And if you're struggling with weight, you need to stop it. Eat a whole plant food diet, get rid of the salt, oil, and sugar, and watch you lose weight. If you're a male, you can expect to lose 3 pounds a week. That's 150 pounds a year rate on a diligent whole plant food diet with moderate exercise. If you're a woman, you'll only lose about 2 pounds a week, about 50% less. Because as I said, women are basically energy conserving fat storage devices. They're full of estrogen, which is a fat storage hormone. So women are more efficient at storing fat than males. Males are full of testosterone, which is a fat burning hormone. When we talk about if you inject women with enough testosterone, their fat melts off them. But the problem is then they get hairy and get cancer and die. So it's not a good weight loss strategy. But if you inject men with estrogen, they get fat, they grow breasts and get hips. So these differences, I think, are mostly biological, not psychological. And so if you're a woman, what does that mean? It means you have to work twice as hard and you get half the results. So you should get used to it.
Well, thanks. There's a couple of live viewers like Tanya and Susanna that say that story does sound familiar to them and that they think they heard it from Dr. Lyle.
Well, if you go on a diet, a husband and wife go on a diet, I mean, every woman will tell you they don't lose weight at the same rate. The woman's perfect in weighs and 3 ounces. And the guy, she doesn't realize, but he snuck out to In-N-Out Burger at lunchtime and he's still losing weight. So it basically says that life is not fair. So I think people should, learn that and then just accept it and move on.
Yep. So do you think food addiction is not a very good name because it's not really food addiction, it's chemical addiction?
Yeah, I think it's just addiction. And I think if you eliminate the chemicals that add to the food, you'd have much less issues in terms of, eating related issues. I'm sure there's other factors besides this, AJ. I don't think this is 100% of the story of food addiction, but it's a major and dominant part of the story for overweight. So I'm sure there are people that have psychological difficulties in relation to food for other issues other than the pleasure trap and dopamine production. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that. But as far as in my experience clinically, if we bring patients to the center and we feed them a whole plant food, SOS-free diet, they lose weight in very predictable manner. And that's true for the psychologically challenged patients and the people that are coming in with all kinds of loving support. The difference is that it's a lot easier to make good decisions if you have a lot of support than if you're in an antagonistic environment. So for those people that have supportive friends and supportive spouses and mates and don't have teenage kids, yeah, it's going to be a lot easier. Does it mean if you have teenage kids and your mate isn't supportive and your friends are not helpful, you can't do it? No, you can do it. You have to work a lot harder. The odds are going to be against you, but it doesn't mean you can't overcome those odds. You just have to be prepared to pay the price. And the price is healthful living. It's diet, sleep, exercise. And then sometimes you have to learn to say the N word in public. The N word is no. And no, it's an important expression that many people are trained not to say because they're afraid if they say it, their face would break. And, you have to sometimes practice it. You ask people, some of those say no, and they're like, they can't do it because they're trained to never say no.
Funny.
You have to learn to say no.
Tammy says, do you think there could be an addiction to plant-based foods?
Yeah, highly processed fractionated foods that have salt, oil, and sugar. You can be just as addicted to plant-based foods as you are animal foods if you put enough salt, oil, and sugar on it. The difference is, though, the animal foods have really high caloric density because of their high fat concentration, high protein, which leads to problems with kidney disease, cancer, heart disease, and are also, more devastating in terms of their biological concentration of poisons. A calorie of plant foods compared to a calorie of animal foods, a calorie of animal foods could have 2 to 1,000 times the concentration of poisons because of the biological concentration of everything from PCBs, dioxin, pesticide residues, etc. Whereas plants are not as efficient at biologically concentrating these poisons. As a consequence, you'd be a lot better off eating your plant-based foods than your animal-based foods if your goal is to minimize toxicity.
Yeah. So I've heard people say that they feel like they're addicted to certain whole natural foods when they're very high in fat. People have told me, especially with nuts and nut butters, seeds and seed butters, and even sometimes avocado, that they cannot stop eating those foods, even when they're not putting sugar, oil, and salt on them.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, a nut butter is not a whole natural food. It's a highly processed, highly concentrated, high fat food. So first of all, I would recommend that people that are trying to manage weight don't be using nut butters or highly, it's just like we eat carrots, not carrot juice. Carrot juice is a highly processed fractionated product. So if you're trying to lose weight, you're better off with more whole food, less concentrated. On the other hand, if you're trying to gain weight, or you're feeding kids and you're trying to shove enough calories in so they don't eat too much of that federally subsidized school lunch program at school, you might want to give more concentrated foods. You give them rice pasta instead of rice. You give them carrot juice instead of just whole carrots, because you're trying to increase caloric density. When you're trying to reduce caloric density, you stop with that. And certainly nut butters are substantially easier to overeat on than weighing out a small handful of nuts. But for some people that have issues with, say, for example, nuts, if they have one, there's that ad for potato chips that says, bet you can't just eat one. Well, they're not kidding. And the same thing for some people is true with nuts. So if you have those issues, then you have to either come up with a strategy to regulate your quantity or stop eating them. I have that issue with one nut, and that's cashews. I would tend to overeat cashews. If I just had a bowl of cashews out and I just was eating them, I'd find I would have eaten more than I probably should. And so I had to actually come up with a trick to keep myself from overeating cashews. I didn't have that problem with walnuts or almonds or other nuts, but I did with cashews. So what I did was we store nuts in the freezer because it keeps them from going rancid as quickly. And I made a rule, which is I'd bring the nuts out, the cashews out, I would weigh out 1 ounce. I would put the nuts away. And the rule was if I ever went back for seconds, then no more nuts in the house. And I did that 38 years ago. We still have nuts in the house because every time I wanted to go back, and I wanted to go back, but every time I did, I'd say, oh my gosh, but I really like cashews. I don't want to not be able to have them in the house anymore. And that was enough to kind of keep me in line. But for some people, that wouldn't be enough. And so for them, they need to not have it in the house. So you have to know yourself, your own limitations.
What do you think is so different or special about cashews that make them so irresistible?
Well, they're a little bit more processed than even raw cashews are still heat processed. They're probably a little more concentrated. They're very high in fat. And, I particularly like them. So, it's just one of those things. So I still get to have them, but I limit the quantity and that's solved my problem. I think that nuts themselves are whole natural foods, but they are very concentrated. And so for some people, that's more than they can manage. I would encourage people, though, to try to develop management strategies because it's nice to have as broad a diet as possible. And if you're able to do that, that's great. If you're not able to do it, then you have to adapt. And that, for some people, means not having it in the house.
So we won't drop dead if we don't eat nuts.
No, you're not going to drop dead if you don't eat nuts. In fact, even if you're looking for really concentrated sources of fat, some people find if they can't regulate themselves with nuts, they might be able to do okay with seeds, maybe flax seeds or hemp seeds or something else that don't have the same appeal ratio. And if not, you have to eat more of the other foods that are rich in essential fatty acids, like green vegetable materials. In a worst case scenario where you needed a lot, but you just couldn't get enough greens in or something, you might have to resort to supplementation of something like DHA. But, we try to avoid pills and potions and powders, with the exception of vitamin B12, because B12 comes from bacteria. Normally, you'd never have to worry about it. But because we learned that by washing and peeling and being very hygienic, we could avoid worms and parasites, we've gotten to the point where we can limit our bacterial exposure to such extent that over enough years, vegans can develop B12 deficiency. So that's the one nutrient we do recommend routine supplementation of 1,000 micrograms of methylcobalamin a day. And fortunately, that meets virtually everybody's needs.
All right. So Susanna asks a question, peanuts are not a nut. They're technically a legume. She wants to know why peanuts and peanut butter are so darn addictive.
Well, peanuts have some problems. Number one, they're, as you said, they're really not even a nut. They're a bean, they're a legume. They tend to be stored and served roasted. So you have a high temperature roasting of a high fat food that leads to some byproducts that are not acceptable. The way they're stored, they're often contaminated with a mold called aflatoxin, which causes liver cancer and other problems. And so these are a really high saturated food, high fat, cooked at high temperature type food. And often they make it even worse by salting it and creating a real mess. So I wouldn't recommend the use of traditionally available peanuts or peanut butter because of their frequent contamination. If you raised them yourself, you ate small enough quantities, maybe you get away with that. Just not one of my most recommended foods.
Well, what about PB2 or almond butter too? A lot of people, even the ones that say they follow an SOS-free diet, it's like they defat the peanuts or the almonds and it's this powder.
Yeah, I'm not a big favor of concentrated protein powders of any kind. I mean, we're trying to reduce the protein level into a healthy level. And so even too much nuts, too much beans, these foods in excess quantity can increase your protein intake, higher than probably what's ideal. You never have to worry about it on a true whole natural food diet because, foods in balance give you proportional nutrition. You don't have to worry about that. And in fact, the nutrients that are available from whole foods may be potentiated and available at a much higher ratio than from pills and potions and powders and fractionated foods. In fact, your viewers might be interested in reading Dr. T. Colin Campbell's book, Whole. A brilliant scientist who did a great job kind of really looking at the whole diet compared to the fractionated diet and many of the benefits of eating a whole natural food diet.
Yeah. So there's a food, well, it's a processed food, and I know you're not a fan of it. You might be the only plant-based doctor that gives it the kibosh, and that's nutritional yeast. And I'm wondering, not so much why it's unhealthy, but I've talked to people that for them, it has an addictive process, they use it a lot.
Yeah, it's a highly processed fractionated food. So when people go start restricting their diet, they just continue to crave the most concentrated food that are available. And they want to pretend that it's some kind of health food when it's really just a food byproduct. And again, I don't have a fundamental objective. Somebody liked the disgusting taste of yeast and they wanted to sprinkle a little on something occasionally and they didn't get carried away. Maybe they'd get away with it. But it's certainly not a health food. It's really a single cell organism. It's really more of an animalcule, if you will. And I don't see any real significant redeeming benefit. Some people have issues that may stimulate some fermentation and other problems for their digestive system. I think that if you're using it like a spice or something, I don't have a huge problem with it. But if you're using it as a food replacement, that may become a significant problem. And there have, the formation of monosodium glutamate and other products that are thought to be irritating may be accentuated by high yeast intake. So I think that generally that would be put on the be careful with it category.
Yeah. It's calorically dense.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Any highly fractionated food product tends to be calorically dense. That's why people like it.
So what about chocolate? What if it's unsweetened? There's chocolate. Let's just say, I know how you feel about chocolate with dairy and sugar, but you can get chocolate now that's completely unsweetened. You can get cocoa powder that's even been decaffeinated and defatted. So why is chocolate a problem for people?
Well, chocolate's a huge problem. Typical chocolate is 2,500 calories a pound. I mean, you might as well just melt it down and rub it all over your belly, and hips where it's going to end up. And at least then you could wash it off and not carry it around all week. It's full of caffeine, which is a highly addictive nervous system stimulant. Has hundreds of other chemicals in it. This is a highly fractionated food byproduct that is, think about chocolate has a higher caloric density than ice cream. or bread, or even pure sugar. So these are very, very contrary foods. If you're trying to lose weight, I wouldn't be recommending taking foods with highly addictive nervous system stimulants in them or excess caloric density, or any of the other materials that make chocolate so appealing to people. It's definitely a drug-like effect.
And caffeine?
Well, caffeine is a problem. It's a highly addictive nervous system stimulant. It's particularly objectionable to me that we're giving our children this highly addictive drug in the form of their chocolate or their Coca-Colas or their even now people are taking concentrated caffeine for its stimulatory effect. I mean, you wouldn't give your kids cocaine. You shouldn't give your kids caffeine either.
So for people particularly that are struggling with weight or food addiction, things like caffeine and cocoa and PB2, are these good things or?
No, these are things that if you want to get healthy and lose weight, stop it. What I tell patients is just go inside themselves and ask themselves, do they really, 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 really want whatever it is? And if the answer is really, truly yes, then you know. You can't have it. You get nothing. If you're getting that kind of intense emotional response, it's likely because it's activating the pleasure trap. Just get a t-shirt that says, I get nothing, and then you don't have to worry about it.
But they say it's too hard.
It is very difficult, but if you want to be successful, that's what works. I'm not saying it's for everybody. It's not for everybody to get healthy and to be fit. And, that's for people that have the capacity to make those changes. The thing that I object to is people thinking they can't do it because it's hard, or thinking they can't do it because they tried and they failed. Because in my experience, most people can do it. It's only a question of how hard do they have to work. It's like saying, oh, it's too hard to quit smoking. Is it hard to quit smoking? Yeah, it's really hard to quit smoking. In fact, some people, it's so hard they can't do it on their own. They come to the center and we put them on a fast, and within a few days, they're free of nicotine. And some people say, oh, it's too hard to quit drinking. It is hard. And sometimes you have to go and get some help to quit drinking. You can't just quit just because you decided. You may need a little support. But, in my experience, when people fast after a few days, they're free of alcohol addiction. You still have psychological issues you have to address. And that's why you have people that are called psychotherapists, because they do behavioral cognitive therapy and help people deal with the very real issues in their life that make it difficult for them to make good decisions. So there's physical issues and there's psychological issues. The physical issues are very straightforward and we can deal with those effectively. The psychological issues can be a little more complicated. That's why there's people like Dr. Lyle, and we turf all that to him and then blame him if they're struggling.
Dr. Goldhamer, I learned about an SOS-free diet from you 12 years ago, and I adopted it and I teach it. And I found that a lot of people, they claimed they were avoiding sugar, oil, and salt, but were consuming flour and alcohol.
Right.
And so I coined a new acronym for a SOFAS-free diet: sugar, oil, flour, alcohol, and salt. And I'm wondering if you can comment on flour and alcohol, but especially with people that suffer from addictions.
Under my definition of sugar, that includes all refined carbohydrates. That includes the flours. That's part of the refined carbohydrates. And you're absolutely right. Refined carbohydrates, and particularly in the terms of flour, make it very difficult for people to lose weight. They're eating whole wheat bread, so they think they're on a healthy diet. They're eating whole wheat pasta. They're eating foods that everybody else thinks is healthy, but in reality are just somewhat less harmful than the traditional versions of the highly processed foods. So yeah, people that are thinking they can't lose weight, it's usually because they're not absolutely crystal clear about what it is they need to control and put in their mouth. And the other thing that people do that have struggled losing weight is they don't eat enough. You have to eat a lot of salad and steamed vegetables in order to reach satiety, so that there's nothing room left to overeat on the other foods. If you're not getting enough calories to maintain optimum weight, your brain is going to punish you. And especially if you're a woman, if you're a woman and you're losing weight, your brain isn't going, oh, good on you, girl, lose that fat. Your brain is saying, what are you doing? We've worked hard to store those strategic fat reserves so that you can survive pregnancy. You are hemorrhaging strategic fat reserves. Stop it. And your brain will try to get you to stop eating that salad that isn't going to help and go get some peanut brittle or something that'll help slow down the hemorrhaging of your fat stores. That's why I think it's easier to stabilize weight than lose weight. When you're actively losing weight, your brain is letting you know that you are using up your precious fat stores. When you're at a stable weight, at least you're not hemorrhaging fat stores. And so I think you'll find it's easier to stay at whatever weight you are than it is to actively lose weight. That's where sometimes fasting is useful. People lose a bunch of weight fasting, and then we can get them to behave well enough to stabilize, but it's hard to get them to behave that they can run at a caloric deficit because they have to overcome 1 billion years of biology that's telling them not to lose the fat.
What about other chemicals that are added to the food? Dyes, stabilizers, additives, natural flavors, artificial flavors, citric acid. What about these things?
Yeah, they probably also are involving altering satiety mechanisms. Although I have to say, I haven't been as familiar with the research on those chemicals as we were on the sugar and the oil and the caloric density. So there's probably another mechanism out there. I'm sure if you ask Dr. Lyle, he's probably familiar with that literature. I'm not. Because in my world, those things don't really exist anyway. If you're eating a whole plant food diet, there is no chemicalized, version of that. So basically, we've eliminated all that. But how big a factor they play compared to the sugar, the oil, I can't say with certainty. Almost certainly, though, there's an influence that they're having. Because, especially you look at like non-caloric beverages that don't have any sugar, but they definitely are associated with failure of weight loss.
Do you think the problem is there's a mismatch between our Stone Age brain and the environment, the food environment that we're in now?
Yeah, we've changed the environment and we've added these highly processed fractionated foods, and we've created the very problems that we're dealing with. And we've gone into denial about them. And so as a consequence, people are they can't even imagine giving up these chemicals. It's like asking, if you ask an alcoholic to give up alcohol, they don't go, "Oh, you mean my life sucks because I'm drinking alcohol? Oh, well, then I'll just stop. Thank you so much for your loving attention." What do they say? They say, "Mind your own effing business." They don't want to hear about it. They're not interested because they're addicts. And the idea of going through the pain of withdrawal is so overwhelming. They just can't imagine. And how would life be worth living if they had to remove their artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain, the one consistent source of pleasure that they've got? And people whose lives kind of suck, I think, are even more vulnerable to the pleasure trap because they're not getting the normal positive feedback from their loving relationships, their productive activity, their supportive environment, et cetera. Those are deficits. And so the only reliable source of neurostimulation that they're getting on the pleasure front might be from these very drug-like effects. And so when you're going to get people to be well, you not only have to get them to clean up their diet, you have to get them to clean up their life. And that means they may have to clean up some of the energy vampires in their life. And energy vampires are people that do what they do best, and that's make other people as fat and sick and miserable as they are. So by comparison, they don't have to feel so bad. Energy vampires don't like it when their friends are successful because it reminds them just how bad their own situation is. Whereas if everybody around them is suffering, they don't have to feel so bad by comparison. They're not making that comparison. So they will do everything they can to undermine your health and happiness. They're the people, like if you're a woman and you lose 50 pounds and you go to work, all the women are not going, "Oh dear, you've done so well. We're so proud of you. How can we be supportive?" No, you walk in and it's like, "Oh, here she comes, that bitch." They know why you lost weight, and they're going to try to undermine your success because you're trying to make them look bad. And so they'll bring you cupcakes and tell you that it's not good to be a fanatic and ask you where you're going to get your protein from, and just do everything they can to make your life miserable so that you will fail. It's interesting, men don't seem to have that much challenge with this because if men lose 50 pounds and go to work, the other men don't notice. And if they do notice, they don't care. And so it's a little bit easier for the men, I think, in general, than the women, just because of the differences that you see stereotypically in the female culture versus the male culture. There are biological differences and there are cultural differences. And again, these are all generalities, but in general, I think it holds true. It's harder for women than it is for men, everything else being equal, to deal with the consequence socially of making radical dietary changes.
Yeah, well, Katie says, "I absolutely love the way Dr. Goldhamer cuts through all the crap and says how it is." So when people can't stop a substance, whether it's, PB2 or nutritional yeast or cocoa powder, or alcohol, or their caffeinated beverages, is it because they're addicts, or because they don't resonate with that? They just say,
well, they cannot resonate with it, but here's how you tell it. Stop it. If you can't, like if I said to you, "Hey, stop eating carrots," would people go, "Stop eating carrots"? Well, I couldn't do that. I mean, oh my gosh, it would be, no, you'd say, "Okay, fine, I won't eat carrots for a week." Big deal. Who cares? It doesn't mean you don't like carrots, but you can certainly live without it. But if you say to somebody, no chocolate for a week, and they go into conniptions, well, what do you think that's about?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. 0-calorie sweeteners, erythritol, xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol, aspartame, stevia. Can these also be addictive for people?
I don't know if addictive is necessarily technically the right term. I don't know what the withdrawal effects. I don't have a lot of experience, obviously, AJ, with these substances. It's not something we use. It's not something that, you know, we're dealing with actively. So I don't know if we can really talk about them as being addictive. What I do know, though, is that there's good evidence that people that use those substances for the purposes of trying to improve their health are gravely disappointed with the long-term effects, and they are not an effective strategy for weight loss. So clearly they're not benefiting people. And honestly, once you start taking all these chemicals and start pouring them into the body, I think you're asking for nothing but trouble, not the least of which is the effect that they may have on the microbiome. The trillion creatures that live in your digestive system that are important for your immune response, for your nutrient production, your apostatic mechanisms and appetite regulation. And so anything that's altering the gut microbiome in a negative way is probably detrimental. One big thing to alter the gut microbiome is animal foods. People that eat meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy have completely different organisms than people that are on plant-based diets. Plant-based eaters have 1,000 different strain of organisms important to protect us from organisms and illness. Animal eaters, for example, produce a lot more TMA, which is trimethylamine oxidase, which is associated with colon cancer and other problems. So, you know, and that's produced by the organisms that live in the gut. So if you want to have those organisms pooling fertilizer into you, like vitamin K, instead of TMA and toxic waste, you have to feed the organisms the food consistent with healthy organisms, and that's plants. Plant-based food eaters have healthy gut microbiomes, assuming they're SOS free, compared to people that are animal food eater, highly processed fractionated food eaters. And we're just learning about the microbiome, an important part it plays in maintaining health. And I think that we may find that many of these chemicals may also have an effect on the microbiome, as well as on brain mechanisms as well. But again, don't know that literature well. Again, I would defer you to Dr. Lyle, who tends to read everything.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, I heard a lot that it's not favorable for the GI tract, the gut microbiome. I've seen people, Dr. Goldhamer, that for them it's been addictive, where they've had these little bottles of stevia, not the green leaf, but the processed liquids that come in different flavors like chocolate and butterscotch, and they have to add it to everything, even their water. So I have seen people not be able to give those sweeteners up. So I get asked to endorse a lot of products and promote them. And, you know, my number one rule, of course, it has to be vegan. But I'm curious what you think about the ingredients in this product. This man got back to me and he sent me something. And let me finish before you comment, if you don't mind. He says the ingredients are fresh pressed sugarcane juice, ginger juice, lime juice, and spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves. And then in capitals, it says it's vegan. Mostly it is non-alcoholic. This is one of the highest growing market segments with our product. The idea is one could have a social event where everything served has our product in it and everyone can still drive home, avoiding the complications of alcohol. So it's a ginger beer, but what do you think of just in general pressed cane juice? Is that still sugar?
No, it's just sugar. This is just sugar water with some spices to it. It's just like what they're doing with soda pop vinegars, where they'll take vinegar and add a bunch of sugar to it. They'll call it grape mist and pretend that it's not sugar. So pretending is great, but it doesn't have anything to do with reality. So you're basically taking, you know, soda pop with different chemicals.
So it's not something we will ever see served at the TrueNorth Health Center.
You won't be finding it served at the TrueNorth Health Center or in the Goldhamer household.
Yeah. Susanna, who's done a wonderful job following your protocol, she's lost 60 pounds, wants to know, will my former addictions to sugar, oil, and flour ever go away permanently?
Well, I think we're all vulnerable to the tendency to overdo these highly processed substances. Some of our personalities are such that we're more vulnerable than others. Some of it's augmented by biological issues. So the biological issues may become less dominant, but their tendency is still going to be there. And I don't know about the psychological issues. That would be something I'd defer to Dr. Lyle.
Great. You have to leave at a certain time, right? I want to respect your time. Okay. Is that time right now, or is there time?
No, I have 4 minutes before I need.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Because I also want to be able to say goodbye. So here is a question. from faith. And the question is, how can we best support those who are addicted to food if we want to help them? What's the best way to help them navigate making changes and keep them out of the ego trap? So that's that concept where if we do too strict of a Goldhamer diet, some people just give up.
Yeah, the ego trap and the pleasure trap are always fighting each other. The pleasure trap says, if you eat a little bit, you may want to eat a lot, and it's easier just to not eat any. The ego trap says, well, if I can't have a little bit, I'll feel deprived, and and then I rebound, because if I'm going to have a little bit, I might as well have the whole thing. So ego trap and pleasure trap are big problems. Some people are really vulnerable to the pleasure trap. Some people are really vulnerable to the ego trap. Unfortunately, many people are vulnerable to both. And if you're vulnerable to both, you have to work twice as hard as you would if it was just the ego trap. You can have a little bit, you're not vulnerable to the pleasure trap, it's great. If you're just vulnerable to the pleasure trap, all you have to do is stop it and you're fine. But if you're vulnerable to both, you're going to have an ongoing battle at trying to come up with a balance that's going to work. And honestly, I think the people that are vulnerable to both really have probably the most difficult thing they're going to face in their lifetime, is trying to figure out how to get to that balance. Fortunately for me, the pleasure trap is the dominant battle that I have, and by just not eating anything, I don't have any trouble at all. So I wasn't as vulnerable to the ego trap. Dr. Lau says because I have a dominant reptilian brain that has little to do with human being. But anyway, that may be the case. And I'm just grateful for that, though, because obviously it's a great burden to have to struggle with both of these different variances, and trying to come up with a pattern that works for you can be very, very difficult. We eliminate some of the challenges when we have patients at the center, because they're in a controlled environment. So the only choices are good choices, and people make good choices, and people do great. And what I found is some people have trouble when they go home, because they're in an environment of temptation. And what I thought, my first suggestion was maybe we just have people going home. We just keep them at the center. And I think that would dramatically improve our compliance. Unfortunately, it turns out that's not practical, because we don't have enough capacity to keep everybody there forever. And so now what we're trying to do is come up with strategies to help people when they go home, so that they can have better ability to make better choices. And we're offering live streaming, we're offering books and videos, and they have programs like you offer to give people ongoing support. And there's people like Leafside and Mama Says and Well Your World that make convenience foods that are SOS free, so that they have choices that are quick and easy, but with less temptations. And hopefully the combination of all those will increase the number of people that can navigate this successfully. But I don't want to pretend that this is an easy problem. This is a huge challenge. And it's particularly difficult for people that maybe don't have the support of loving spouses and supportive kids and friendly and work in good environments. As you know, AJ, not everybody is living in an environment that's highly supportive of this. In fact, most people are living in places that are frankly antagonistic.
Right. And that makes it harder, doesn't it? If they
It
don't
does.
an environment.
Makes it really difficult.
Well, Dr. Goldhamer, I want to thank you so much for your work, because I don't believe I would be where I am today if I had not have found you, because there are many people in the vegan world that will say, oh, it's too extreme to tell people no sugar and salt or flour. And, that may be true. But I will say, for people specifically suffering with food addictions, I think your approach is really the only one that works, and it's the only one that I can recommend for people that suffer particularly with food addictions.
Well, if you come up with an improvement or a better way, let me know, because we'll change the program to match it. We're doing what we do because we found that's what works. We've been doing this for 39 years. We had 21,000 people go through our protocol. That there are a certain percentage of people that are successful. We've got some new research showing some long-term 1-year follow-up data supporting the fact that our success rate was substantially higher than Dr. Lau predicted, I might point out. And as a consequence, we do believe we're onto something. It may not work for everybody, but at least for those people that are highly motivated, we have a pattern that can work.
Right. And it's even if people can reverse their diseases with a little sugar and flour and salt and chocolate, for people that have those cravings and compulsions, the Goldhamer way, I feel, is the best way. And I have something for people that say it's too hard.
I'm not sure that's politically correct.
Yeah. Anyway, Dr. Goldhamer, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you stand for and the work you've done and everything you've done for the world. Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back at 2 p.m. when we hear a success story of someone who did what Dr. Goldhamer said and lost